Greetings. Glad that you can be with me today. I'm Steve Cole, the pastor of the First Methodist Church in Oswego, Kansas, and the West Mineral Church in West Mineral, Kansas. Today we're going to be going back to the Old Testament. We're looking at the beginnings of one of the leaders of the Hebrew people, at least the beginnings of his time anyway. We're going to be looking at the life of Moses. But how does that begin? It begins with his birth. And so we'll be looking at Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. We know that the people who came to Egypt because there was a drought, and Joseph was in charge of the grain in Egypt. So they came and they got grain, and Joseph said, just come live with me. And so they came and they got what's called the land of Goshen. And everything started out pretty good for the first who knows how many years. But 400 years later, it seems that the new Pharaoh, 400 years later, didn't know anything about Joseph or what the deal that Joseph had made or anything. And the Hebrew people had become quite numerous, so they decided to make them slaves. So they were all in slavery in Egypt. And Pharaoh had an idea. There's getting to be too many Hebrews. And so he instructed that the male children should be killed. Eventually he said that they should all be thrown into the Nile River. Well, as you can imagine, that didn't go over very well. And of course Moses was born, and here's kind of the story of what took place after Moses was born. Now, a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when they could hide him no longer, she got a paper basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the river bank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying. She felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. The girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. May God add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of his word. Well, this is no doubt a story that many of us know from either learning about it in Sunday school or whatever. It's one of those stories that I don't remember that much about growing up, going to Sunday school, but there's a few stories that I remember from the Bible. Of course, the story of Adam and Eve and Noah and the ark, and this story about the baby Moses in the basket, and of course later David and Goliath and Samson. Those are the ones that we remember. And this is one of those particular stories that we all have heard at one time or another. And we have questions about it, but we wonder, why did Moses' mother do what she did? But we kind of look at it and we kind of wonder, okay, it's a nice story, but what does it mean to us, especially? I mean, is it more than, is it just a nice story? I mean, it tells them of the beginnings of Moses, but yeah, does it really have any meaning for us? Well, it tells us in Hebrews 11:23. Here we're going to the New Testament now, looking back at the faith that people had. But in Hebrews 11:23 it says, by faith Moses' parents hid him for 3 months, and after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. They had faith. They had faith that God would protect the child. And Moses' mother did do what Pharaoh had said, that baby boys should be put in the Nile. She put him in the Nile. Didn't. Of course, the idea was that they would be crocodile food, but instead she put him in this basket. Now, we really don't know, did she plan this all out? We don't know. We don't know. There's nothing to really tell us for sure how this happened, but we do know that his sister did watch what happened, and it just happened to be placed close to where Pharaoh's daughter would be bathing. So, who knows? Regardless. But she didn't know what the outcome would be. No. Put her trust in God. That God was, she kind of let him go. And put her faith in God, that God would take care of her child. Well, and that story is kind of a story, we might say, in a sense of death and resurrection, because here she was giving him over to more than likely die, and yet he is saved and goes on. We know that God has great things in store for this little baby, but that's another story for another time. So, again, what does this story mean for us? Well, it's the idea that, that in uncertain times, because these were indeed uncertain times for the Hebrew people, what were they going to do? They were stuck. They were slaves. How were they going to get out of this situation? And God had promised them this land of Canaan, the promised land, that it would be theirs. And here's 400 years have gone by, and they still don't have that land, and it doesn't look like there's any way they're ever going to get that land, because they are stuck as slaves in Egypt, right? It was an uncertain time. But we live in some uncertain times right now. There's a lot of concern about the war with Ukraine and Russia and how that's all going to be out, and the involvement of other countries getting involved with that whole thing. And I heard something not long ago that one of the biggest fears that people have right now is that we may be in for World War III. We don't hear a whole lot said about that, but yet it's evidently in the back of people's minds right now, that they're wondering, where is this all going to end up in the long run? And we've seen a lot of natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, fires, hurricanes, lots of different things going on right now. And we wonder, and of course we still wonder, will the COVID-19, or COVID, we might say, or some variation of it anyway, will it come back? Will we have to deal with that? Plus all the, every time we turn around, there's another mass shooting of some sort or another. We do live in some uncertain times, and the gap between the rich and the poor seems to be getting larger. We wonder about that. I talked to our district superintendent a while back, and the district superintendent says, well, how are the churches that you're the pastor of doing? And I said, well, they're holding their own. They're hanging in there. And she said, well, that's better than a lot of our churches right now. Made me think about that. One time we were concerned if a church wasn't growing, there was a problem. We had to find a way to help that church grow and bring in more people. Now, if we're just maintaining what we have, we think that's pretty good. Things are different than they were a few years ago. So, yeah, we are there. And we, of course, deal with all these different things with the economy and that. Yeah. And I know that there are a couple of churches that give out meals to people that are in need, a free meal for whoever wants it. And I know of one, and they talk about that the numbers have increased dramatically in the last year or so. I know one church that about a couple of years ago was serving about 150 meals a week to people. It is now serving 500 meals a week. In just a couple of years, it's changed that much. So we wonder, what can we do? And what can we put our faith in? Is there anything that we can put our faith in that we can look to? And it's evidently not Wall Street and the stock market. That changes almost all the time. Politics and politicians, the government. Can we put our faith in that? Well, we kind of wonder about that. And of course, we're told as Christians, put our trust in God. And we even put on our money, don't we? Our money says, in God we trust. I remember a little small town cafe had a sign up on the wall that said, in God we trust, all others pay cash. Oh boy. Well, that's where we put our trust. That's where we put our hope. That despite all the things that are happening, God's not going to suddenly come along and control the stock market. He's not going to bail out Wall Street. God's not going to help somebody that's getting their home loan foreclosed on or their car taken away. God isn't going to make somebody's credit rating get better. No. But if those things do happen, God is there to help us as we go through those things in life, whether it has to do with our finances or our health or whatever is going on in the world, disasters. God is there. It may not prevent those things from happening, but God is with us as we go through those different things. Some of our parents and grandparents lived through a thing called the Depression. My grandparents raised their families, both of them on both sides of my grandparents, were married and raised their children during the Depression. And they had, but the good thing is that they were on the farm. They had food. They had chickens and cows, pigs, a big garden. They didn't need for food. They didn't have a whole lot of money, but they had food to eat. And they were able to get by with that. They did what they could. And my grandmother, one of those people, is probably one of the people that had more faith than just about anybody else I've ever known. That, didn't lose her faith because of what they had to go through during the Depression, and World War II, and all those things. She maintained in Vietnam. She kept the faith throughout all that. None of us knows what the future is going to bring. Moses' mother really didn't know for sure what was going to happen to him when she put him in that basket and put him in the Nile River. She stepped out in faith and gave him over to God. There are times when we have done everything we can think of, and there's nothing else to do but trust in God. I can think of people that have had cancer, that they go through the chemotherapy or the radiation or whatever treatments. They do whatever the doctors tell them to do. They've done everything they could possibly do. Ultimately, though, they have to put their trust in God. That God is there. And I think that's where a lot of our churches are right now, especially in the more rural areas. That, for many years we were told, well, try this program, try that program, do this, do that, tell us to do all these different things, trying to get more people in the church, to make the church more, as we would use the term, vital. And that's an interesting thing, is how do you assess that? And it seems like for a lot of our churches that did do all the things that they were asked to do, still are struggling. And we say, well, but they've been faithful. They're still there. They're still holding services. They're still praising God. They're still worshiping. And, that maybe the numbers aren't as big as they were at once upon a time, but they are still doing what they are supposed to do. They're worshiping God, honoring God, praising God, and they're being faithful. And so it's in God's hands what the future might bring. They may come back to, well, I wouldn't necessarily say back to life, but have new life, I guess, come and be reinvigorated, or they may end up closing. Who knows? But we put it in God's hands. After we've done everything we can do, we look to God, to what God will do. But back in the colonial period, when this country was not this country, it was still part of, probably Great Britain at the time. Faith wasn't really a big thing. Oh, there were a few places here and there. There were people that come to avoid religious persecution, and there were some very faithful people that came to this country. But there was a time when church attendance and people were not interested in spiritual things. There was kind of a decadent lifestyle that people had at that time in the 1700s, before the Revolutionary War, and even during it. People that did go to church were mainly in the cities, and the more, you'd say, wealthier end of people were the ones that went to church. Poor people, the more regular, ordinary people, didn't pay a whole lot of attention. And then something happened. They call it the Great Awakening. And people have studied it, tried to analyze it, tried to figure out what caused this Great Awakening. Because all of a sudden, people started coming to faith in Christ. They started new churches, and churches that were already existing started having more and more people coming in. And people were asking Christ to come into their life. Life changed. It changed. And the question is, why? And they've tried to analyze it. Was it the preachers? And they named some well-known preachers of the day that were pretty dynamic. Could be. Maybe it was the methods that they used. Maybe they're doing something a little bit different. Maybe more exciting preaching. Who knows? Or maybe it was the Holy Spirit working, convicting people of their need for God. And who's to say that might not happen again? And there are pockets here and there of places that this has happened. Not totally widespread, but it has. And there are places where the churches are doing quite well. And so it's not all bad news. There are some good places. And even in some other countries, like Africa, seems like people are coming to faith in Jesus throughout Africa. It's growing quite rapidly, and in South Korea as well. In fact, there's so many people coming to faith in South Korea that some of them are coming to this country. Some of them are our pastors of some of our churches are people from South Korea because we can't find enough pastors here. So, yeah, there are some places that those things are happening. So, what does it mean? What does it take? Does it take a dynamic speaker? Does it take wonderful music? A new method, a new way of doing things? Or maybe we need to be faithful. Put our faith in God. Trust Him. It's up to us. Well, thank you for coming. I'm glad that you could be with me today. And we know that God goes with us to guide us, lead us, and help us today and every day. Amen.